February 14th, 2026, 6:41 in the morning. Port of Tacoma, BNSF Intermodal Yard, Track 7 Delta. Daniel Voss walked the consist the same way he had walked it for 23 years. Left hand on the railcar frame, eyes down the line, counting. He counted 12 well cars on manifest 4471. He counted 13 on Track 7 Delta. That single number, the difference between 12 and 13, would trigger a federal investigation spanning 3 countries, 19 months of active intelligence work, and the largest seizure of Iranian missile guidance hardware ever recorded on American soil. 340 inertial measurement units, 87 missile guidance computers, $11.2 million in shrink-wrapped U.S. currency, recovered not from a black site or a foreign port, but from a rail siding in Pierce County, Washington. It started with a switchman who counted wrong. Except he did not count wrong. Daniel Voss, 51 years old, resident of Lakewood, Washington, 10 miles from the yard. 23 years with BNSF, married. 2 sons, the younger one on a hockey team. Voss coached on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He kept a personal logbook, not required by BNSF protocol, not requested by supervisors, not part of any formal compliance framework. He kept it because he said a number you did not write down was a number you could forget. His supervisor, Gordon Hatch, had described him in a 2023 performance review as meticulous to an operational fault. That phrase would be entered into federal proceedings 13 months after it was written. Voss reported to Track 7 Delta at 6:22 that morning for a routine consist walk. A physical count of cars assigned to manifest 4471, which was scheduled to break for Auburn at 9:15. The manifest listed 12 well cars. Standard configuration for an intermodal pull from the Tacoma Container Yard, Pacific Rim Freight, listed origin, Manzanillo, Mexico, transshipment point for Maquiladora Auto Parts exports. Final destination, Long Beach. He counted 12 cars. Then he counted again. 13. The extra car sat at position 8 in the consist. Container designation IPCU-38-22-4. 53-foot standard well car container. No shipper code on the placard. Not listed in the BNSF yard management system. No documentation in the physical manifest packet. No seal verification sticker from CBP, empty of any outward marking beyond the container number itself. Voss photographed the placard with his personal phone at 6:41 a.m. He photographed the car number, the position in the consist, and the manifest document in his hand showing 12 cars. He then walked to the supervisor shack and told Gordon Hatch there was a 13th container on 7 Delta with no documentation. Hatch told him to leave it alone. He said these things got sorted on the back end, that customs had a lag sometimes, that the Long Beach team would handle the discrepancy at destination. Voss returned to his truck, took out his logbook, and wrote down everything he had just observed: the time, the car number, the manifest number, the conversation with Hatch, and Hatch's response verbatim. Then he opened the BNSF anomaly reporting portal on his phone and filed an IA-7 form at 9:18 a.m. He cited manifest 4471. He cited container IPCU 38224. He cited the undocumented well car at position 8. He attached all 3 photographs. The IA-7 form was reviewed by a BNSF compliance officer at the Pacific Northwest Regional Office. It was flagged as a routine customs lag discrepancy. It was not escalated. It sat in the system for 4 days. Then a compliance algorithm cross-referenced it against an internal audit of CBP clearance records and found an inconsistency. The CBP automated targeting system showed container IPCU 38224 as cleared for entry on February 12th, 2 days before it appeared in the Tacoma yard. The clearance had been logged under a CBP supervisor credential that had not been active since August 2019. The credential belonged to Harold Dempsey, who had retired from U.S. Customs and Border Protection in 2019 after 31 years of service. His electronic access credentials had been disabled. They had not, however, been removed from the legacy authentication pathway that connected CBP's automated targeting system to BNSF's internal routing platform, a pathway built in 2018 and never updated to reflect deactivated personnel. Someone had used Harold Dempsey's login to clear a container that was not on any manifest. The BNSF compliance system was not equipped to process what it had found. It forwarded the flag to the Department of Homeland Security's automated triage inbox. 3 hours and 12 minutes later, a DHS duty analyst named Rachel Okonkwo pulled the flag during a routine queue review. She ran IPCU 38224 through 4 federal databases in 11 minutes and found nothing. No prior history, no registered shipper, no IMO number tie, no insurance manifest. The container existed in one record and one record only: Harold Dempsey's clearance log entry, timestamped 2 days before the container physically appeared on American soil. Okonkwo escalated to her watch supervisor. The watch supervisor called the Defense Security Service duty officer. The DSS duty officer called the National Targeting Center. 37 minutes after Okonkwo pulled the flag, a priority query was issued to the intelligence community requesting all known records on container IPCU 38224 and any associated vessel, port, or transit routing data. The response came back the following morning. It was classified. 3 weeks after Daniel Voss filed his IA-7. On the morning of March 7, 2026, 4 DSS agents knocked on his front door at 4:18 a.m. They were accompanied by an FBI special agent and a woman who identified herself as being from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and who declined to provide her name in writing. They had satellite imagery. They had shipping records. They had timeline documentation. Contained IPCU 38224 had been loaded onto a vessel at Bandar Abbas Port on the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz on February 3rd. 11 days before it appeared on Manifest 4471 at the Port of Tacoma. It had transited the Pacific under a different container designation, redesignated at Vladivostok under a freight consolidation arrangement with a Hong Kong-registered logistics shell company called Meridian Pacific Holdings Limited. The vessel carrying it had arrived at the Port of Tacoma on February 11th. The container redesignated again during offloading, cleared into the BNSF yard under Dempsey's credentials on February 12th, and added to Manifest 4471 by an undetermined party between 10 p.m. on February 13th and 5 a.m. on February 14th. Window before Voss's 6:22 a.m. consist walk. The intelligence community had known about the broader network since the previous October. What they had not known was the terminus point, the final delivery address, or the identity of the American facilitation layer. Voss's IA-7 form had answered all 3 questions in one compliance report. The investigation had a code name before Voss filed his form. It had been called Ferryman. Now it had a fixed American endpoint, a specific routing mechanism, and a named beneficiary: Pacific Rim Distribution Services LLC, a freight brokerage registered in Long Beach, California, operating since 2019 under the management of Felix Aguirre-Mendez, 44, formerly a licensed customs broker whose operating authority had been suspended by the Federal Maritime Commission in 2017 for documentation irregularities and reinstated in 2020 after a successful administrative appeal. This was the pipeline structure. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Procurement Division, specifically the unit responsible for sourcing Western-produced dual-use electronics for the Guided Munitions Program, had identified a gap in U.S. export enforcement in 2023. Not a new gap, an old one. American freight logistics systems, particularly the interface between ocean shipping manifests and domestic rail routing, relied on credential-based clearance processes dating from the early 2000s integration of CBP automation with private freight networks. Those credentials were tied to individuals. When individuals left federal service, the credentials were supposed to be deactivated everywhere. In practice, legacy systems built before modern identity management protocols did not always receive the deactivation signals. Someone had to audit every access pathway every time a credential was deactivated, and no one did. The IRGC procurement unit did not discover this gap through technical exploitation. They discovered it through a human source, someone with knowledge of how CBP's legacy authentication worked, someone who understood the integration between the automated targeting system and BNSF's internal freight router. That source was never charged. The DSS case file lists the original U.S. side intelligence provider as a John Doe defendant, status unresolved. What was confirmed was the mechanism. Between October 2025 and February 2026, 4 shipments moved through the pipeline. The first 3 arrived in October, December, and January without incident. Each was cleared under Dempsey's dormant credentials. Each was received by Pacific Rim Distribution Services, and each was broken down and redistributed through a layered distribution network before federal investigators had sufficient visibility to identify the domestic endpoint. The 4th shipment was February 14th. That was the one Voss counted. The procurement source for the containers came from European and Southeast Asian electronics manufacturers whose export control compliance frameworks contained gaps that IRGC procurement had systematically exploited over 18 months. The specific components recovered from Operation BLACKLINE's April raid, inertial measurement units and missile guidance computers, were commercially available dual-use items, precision navigation hardware with civilian aerospace and industrial applications, export restricted under the Export Administration regulations, but not subject to the most stringent embargo controls governing purpose-built weapons systems. They were gray area hardware, legal to manufacture, legal to sell to most buyers, restricted for sale to Iran under OFAC sanctions and the Export Administration regulations, but not the kind of thing that triggers automatic interdiction at every port of entry. The pipeline operated in this middle ground. The hardware was sourced in multiple small lots from multiple suppliers, aggregated outside the United States and Hong Kong based on Meridian Pacific Holdings registration, though that company dissolved in March 2026, within days of the investigation's existence, becoming known to any outside party. The aggregated hardware was then loaded into standard freight containers alongside legitimate commercial cargo. In this case, genuine automotive components destined for Mexican maquiladora plants and shipped under documentation describing the entire container load as industrial auto parts. The Bandar Abbas connection was critical. That port, operated under the oversight of the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, had a documented history as a transshipment point for sanctioned goods moving through secondary intermediaries. The vessel that carried IPCU 38224 made a documented stop at Bandar Abbas before proceeding east. The satellite imagery shown to Voss on the morning of March 7th captured the loading sequence. A crane, a container, a vessel, a timestamp. 11 days before Tacoma. 3 weeks after that morning, Voss had gone back to coaching hockey on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Federal investigators told him he was a material witness, not a suspect. They told him not to discuss the matter with anyone, including his wife, beyond basic assurance that he was not in legal trouble. He returned the personal phone with the photographs. They gave him a government-issued replacement and told him they would be in touch. The investigation, now in its active surveillance phase running from October 2025 through April 2026, was accumulating evidence on 3 parallel tracks. Track 1, the physical network. BNSF rail routing for all 4 container shipments reconstructed from yard management system logs, manifest records, and GPS transponder data from individual containers where available. Pacific Rim Distribution Services receiving logs. The warehouse at PD's Long Beach facility placed under continuous technical surveillance in October 2025. Vehicle movements in and out of the Long Beach warehouse, documented by fixed surveillance assets. Track 2, the credential exploitation. A forensic reconstruction of exactly how Harold Dempsey's CBP login had been used, from which terminal, at what times, clearing which containers. The forensics revealed a second actor in the BNSF system, someone with direct access to BNSF's internal operations scheduling platform who manually inserted the 4 containers into routing manifests at specific times, always between midnight and 6 a.m., always when vessel arrivals at Tacoma were expected. Through a process of elimination over 11 weeks, the access was traced to a single operations scheduler account, used from a terminal at the BNSF Pacific Northwest Regional Operations Center, assigned to BNSF employee Craig Boll, 49, an 8-year veteran of the company's intermodal routing division. Boll had not been on investigators' radar until the forensic reconstruction. He had no prior federal contacts, no criminal record, no obvious financial irregularities in his personnel file. He was identified purely through the technical trail, his account, his terminal, his shift schedule cross-referenced against the precise insertion times for each of the 4 containers. The insertions happened during Boll's shift or, in one case, February 14th, 36 minutes before his shift began, raising whether someone else had access to his credentials or whether Boll had logged in early for this specific purpose. Investigators determined it was the latter. The February 14th insertion time was an anomaly in his login history. Every other early morning insertion had occurred during his standard shift window. Voss's IS-7 had been filed at 9:18 a.m. Boll's shift began at 7 a.m. If Boll had arrived on his standard schedule on February 14th, he would have had a full 97-minute window before Voss walked the consist to review and correct the manifest, to remove the undocumented 13th container from track 7 Delta before any switchman counted it. He was instead logged in at 6:24 a.m. His car was in the BNSF parking lot by 6:19. He had come in 36 minutes early, executed the insertion at 6:24, and been at his desk doing routine work when Voss called the anomaly in to hatch at approximately 6:45. The margin between exposure and concealment was 36 minutes. If the manifest had been corrected before Voss's walk, container IPIQ 38224 would have reached Long Beach, been received by Pacific Rim Distribution Services, and disappeared into the distribution chain. There would have been no IA-7, no flag, no satellite photography, no 4 a.m. knock. Boll went into federal surveillance on March 19th. Track 3, Felix Aguirre-Mendez and Pacific Rim Distribution Services. Pre-DADS had been a functioning business since 2019. It had legitimate clients, filed legitimate tax returns, maintained a physical warehouse at a Long Beach address that had active forklift traffic, employees, and a standard commercial lease. The illegitimate layer was embedded within it. A subset of container receipts, handled exclusively by Aguirre-Mendez personally, broken out from normal warehouse operations, moved by a separate set of contracted drivers who used a different dispatch platform, and stored in a cordon section of the warehouse not accessible to regular PD's employees. By November 2025, NSA Signals Intelligence identified what were believed to be communications between Aguirre-Mendez and parties in a third country, not Iran directly, but through an intermediary channel using encrypted commercial messaging platforms and, investigators later determined, a physical courier system involving travel to Tijuana. The communications were not fully deciphered. The encryption prevented real-time content access, but the metadata and travel pattern were sufficient to establish the connection as active and ongoing. There was one detail in the case file on Pacific Rim Distribution Services that stood out. Aguirre-Mendez had run a clean operation for 5 years before the IRG connection began. The 2017 suspension of his customs broker license involved documentation irregularities in a Taiwanese electronics import case. Not missile hardware, not sanctions evasion, paperwork inconsistencies on commercial electronics. The administrative appeal that reinstated his license was routine. But it meant Aguirre-Mendez had already navigated one federal process involving electronic components and customs documentation and had come out the other side with his license intact and a detailed knowledge of where the administrative review system's thresholds were set. The investigation's surveillance phase ran from October 2025 through early April 2026. Federal agencies, DSS, FBI, NCIS, ATF, and CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility had been building a layered evidentiary structure. Technical surveillance, financial forensics, physical surveillance, human intelligence, and legal process. 14 subpoenas were issued between October and March. 3 pen register orders. 2 Title III wiretap authorizations, one of which was challenged in post-arrest proceedings on Fourth Amendment grounds, and was still under review as of the most recent public filing. The surveillance operation had not been seamless. 2 significant obstacles arose during the evidence-building phase. The first, in January 2026, a FISA-authorized hardware implant targeting a communications device associated with one of the subjects malfunctioned. The technical failure resulted in a 12-day gap in the coverage of that specific communication stream. Investigators were never fully certain what was communicated during that window. The January 2026 shipment, the third of the four, moved through the pipeline during a portion of that gap period. Whether instructions related to that shipment were transmitted through the compromised channel, and whether those instructions contained information that would have aided investigators in understanding the full scope of the operation, remained an open question in the final case record. The second obstacle was more significant, and it arose from Voss's own action. The IA-7 form that Voss filed on February 14th was, by design, a semi-public document within BNSF's compliance structure. It was visible to BNSF management at multiple levels. Craig Boll, as an operations scheduler with access to the manifest and routing systems, had visibility to compliance flags associated with manifests he had touched. 2 days after Voss filed the IA-7, on February 16th, Boll's communications behavior changed. His personal phone, which was under technical surveillance by that point, showed a spike in encrypted messaging activity. Aguirre-Mendez's phone showed a corresponding spike. The content was not accessible, but the pattern was unmistakable. Boll had seen the IA-7. He knew a switchman had counted 13 cars. The lead DSS case agent made a tactical decision: do not arrest. If they arrested Boll in February, or even signaled awareness of the surveillance, the network would collapse, evidence would be destroyed, and the higher tiers of the operation, including whoever on the Iranian side was coordinating the procurement, might never be identified. The calculus was cold. Let the network remain active, absorb the risk that a fourth shipment was already in transit, and wait for an opportunity to take the entire structure down simultaneously. That decision, whether it was the right one, is worth sitting with. A fourth shipment of missile guidance hardware was allowed to enter the country because arresting Boll in February would have compromised the broader investigation. 340 inertial measurement units, 87 missile guidance computers. They were on American soil for weeks before the raid. The prior 3 shipments, October, December, January, those components remain unaccounted for. Federal investigators have not publicly confirmed their final disposition. The credential gap that made this entire pipeline possible, Harold Dempsey's dormant CBP login, accessible through an authentication pathway built in 2018 and never audited, was not a sophisticated technical exploit. It was administrative negligence at scale. Dempsey retired in 2019. 7 years passed. The pathway remained open. This was not a unique vulnerability. The same post-retirement audit that identified Dempsey's legacy access identified 63 additional dormant credentials with some level of persistent legacy access across connected federal and private freight systems. 63. The BNSF CBP integration specifically had not been subject to a comprehensive credential audit since 2021. The Dempsey vulnerability was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a compliance gap that existed for years before the IRGC found it. The question of who bears institutional responsibility for that gap, CBP, DHS, BNSF, or the vendors who built the integration without adequate credential lifecycle management, has not been resolved in any public proceeding. BNSF's internal compliance framework produced the IA-7 reporting mechanism, the same framework Voss used to flag the anomaly. It also contained a structural flaw. Anomaly reports were reviewable by operations personnel with relevant manifest access. Craig Boll could see Voss's IA-7 because the system gave him visibility. A compliance framework that creates anomaly reports but does not protect those reports from the personnel they might implicate is not a compliance framework. It is a notification system for the people you are trying to catch. Boll should have been caught by BNSF's own internal processes long before the IRGC found him useful. An operations scheduler using a personal shell company to invoice the same freight brokers whose containers he routes through his own facility is a flagged conflict of interest under every corporate compliance standard written in the last 2 decades. BNSF's vendor compliance system either never identified the relationship or identified it and did not act. Either answer is a failure. The institutional vulnerability that gave the IRGC Their access point inside American freight infrastructure was not hidden. It was sitting in a standard compliance review category. No one looked. The surveillance continued through March and into the first week of April. Evidence accumulation was sufficient by late March for the lead prosecutor's office to begin drafting charges. The arrest warrant application was filed under seal on April 4th. It named 6 primary defendants, Felix Aguirre-Mendez, Craig Boll, and 4 additional individuals identified through the financial forensics. 2 Preds, one at a Los Angeles area freight logistics company, and one who served as a physical intermediary between BNSF's Pacific Northwest operations and Aguirre-Mendez's Long Beach network. 2 additional arrests made on the morning of April 11th at locations outside the 3 rail sidings. Targeted individuals identified through surveillance as logistics coordinators for the physical handling of the hardware components after receipt at PRDs. 8 arrests total. 7 locations. By the first week of April, the investigation had identified the 3 rail sidings where containers associated with the 4th shipment were staged: Tacoma, Auburn, Vancouver, Washington. The hardware was physically recoverable, under maintained surveillance. The defendants were known, located, and under monitoring. The tactical decision of whether to execute simultaneously or in sequence was not administratively simple. 3 different federal agencies, ATF, NCIS, and DSS, held jurisdictional primacy over different elements of the case. The weapons aspect, the guidance hardware status as potential missile components, fell to NCIS and DSS under the joint authority of the Arms Export Control Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The domestic conspiracy and fraud charges fell to FBI and ATF. The customs fraud fell to CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility. A simultaneous breach across 3 rail sidings and 4 arrest locations required coordinated warrants and coordinated tactical deployment. It required that no single element of the operation reach any defendant before the others. Because Boll and Aguirre-Mendez had demonstrated in February that they were communicating on a secure channel, and a single arrest before the others would give any unapprehended defendant at least 90 seconds to send a warning. The go order was set for April 11, 2026, 5:47 a.m. 30 minutes before first light. 3 simultaneous teams. The timing placed the breach at the shift transition window, when the sidings were minimally staffed, when no consist departures were scheduled before 7 a.m., when the K9 units could move through the container stacks without requiring removal of adjacent freight. The tactical deployment used ATF SWAT teams supplemented by local law enforcement from Tacoma PD, Auburn PD, and Clark County Sheriff's Office in Vancouver. The K9 units were U.S. Customs and Border Protection teams, detected dogs trained for explosive precursors and electronic component smuggling signatures. At exactly 5:47, all 3 teams breached simultaneously. At the Tacoma siding, 4 containers were under surveillance. The K9 unit made its first positive indication on the 2nd container walked at 5:48 and 30 seconds. By 5:51, all 4 containers at the Tacoma siding had been walked. 3 produced positive K9 indications. At the Auburn siding, 2 containers. K9 hit on the first container walked at 5:48 and 44 seconds. At the Vancouver siding, 2 containers. 1 positive K9 indication at 5:49 and 12 seconds. 6 K9 positive indications across 3 locations in 90 seconds of combined working time. The physical inventory occurred under controlled conditions at a federal evidence facility. ATF evidence technician, DSS representative, State Department export control specialist. The inventory ran from 10 a.m. to 4:40 p.m. on April 11th. 340 inertial measurement units. Model IFR 900 series, commercially produced by a European aerospace subcontractor, export restricted under ER Category 7, Subpart C. Packaged in foam line transit cases, 16 units per case. 21 cases. AT-7 missile guidance computers. Flight navigation processor units, commercially designated FNP-220 series, originally manufactured in the United States, export restricted under ER Category 7, Subpart D serial numbers, traced back to a legitimate sale to an Eastern European aerospace firm, secondary transfer to an entity in Southeast Asia, tertiary movement to the aggregation point, $11.2 million in U.S. currency, shrink-wrapped in standard commercial brick format, interspersed among the hardware components. No fingerprints recoverable. No tracking die. No serial number sequence consistent with a single withdrawal source. Felix Aguirre-Mendez was taken at his residence in Long Beach at 5:49 a.m. Pacific Time. He asked, according to the arresting agent's report, only one question: whether his wife would be told before it appeared in the news. Craig Boll was taken at his home in Puyallup, Washington, at 5:48 a.m. He was in his kitchen. He did not resist. He said nothing. Gordon Hatch, the supervisor who told Voss to leave the 13th container alone, was not among the 8 arrested. He was interviewed 3 times between March and April. He was not charged. His knowledge of the operation, beyond his instruction to Voss on the morning of the 14th, was assessed as insufficient to support criminal charges. Voss testified in the grand jury proceedings and in the preliminary federal hearing by closed-circuit video from a federal safe house in Idaho. His testimony took 4 hours and 14 minutes. He described walking the consist, counting 13 cars, his conversation with Hatch, filing the IA-7, the photographs. He had written all of it down in his logbook on the morning of February 14th, which meant his account was contemporaneous documentation, not reconstructed memory. Operation BLACKLINE recovered 340 inertial measurement units, 87 missile guidance computers, and $11.2 million on April 11, 2026. 8 individuals were arrested. Federal charges were filed in 3 districts. Craig Boll and Felix Aguirre-Mendez entered not guilty pleas at their initial appearances. Trial dates had not been set as of this production. Harold Dempsey's civil complaint against DHS remained pending. The Hong Kong company dissolved in March. Its beneficial ownership records were sealed. The Iranian handlers were never named in U.S. proceedings. The intelligence community assessment described them as operational personnel whose identities were known to IC elements but whose status within Iran precluded any extraterritorial enforcement action. The components from the first 3 shipments, October, December, January, remained unaccounted for in public documentation as of this production. Federal investigators had not confirmed whether those components had been further transshipped, whether they remained within the United States, or whether any had exited the country. The post-breach CBP review did not just find Dempsey's account. It found 63 additional dormant credentials with active legacy pathway access across connected federal and private freight systems. 63. How many were exploited and for what is under ongoing review and has not been publicly disclosed. Credential deactivation should be automated and mandatory, 0 manual steps, 0 legacy exceptions. Right now, it is not. Manifest 4471 listed 12 well cars. There were 13.